Can I borrow $20?
No.
Can I borrow 10?
No.
Well, what about 5? 5?
No. N-O, no. What? Did I do something wrong? Is no a bad word? I had a dream several years ago that helped me gain a new perspective. I was at a bakery, and the bakery had a sign on the window that was advertising that you could buy 2 cakes for the price of 1. So I went into the bakery and I could see all the cakes on display, and I told the woman behind the counter that I'd like to purchase 2 cakes. Well, she looked at me and said, "We don't have 2 cakes." Well, I was confused. I looked back at the display. I could see all the cakes available. And I said, "Well, ma'am, I see the cakes here. Your sign says I could buy 2 cakes for the price of 1. I want to buy 2 cakes. Without flinching, she looked right at me and told me, "We do not have 2 cakes." Now, at that point, I'm starting to feel a bit of frustration because she is deliberately trying to prevent me from taking advantage of this wonderful deal, 2 cakes for the price of 1. And as I'm beginning to generate my next response to this woman, I hear a voice from the outside, an external voice, and it said, "You're supposed to be a Christian." Well, I knew immediately in the dream that this voice was not there to remind me of the character and nature of Christ. Instead, this voice was there to keep me passive, to keep me restrained under the guise of being a good Christian. Well, immediately boldness rose up in me, and I turned to that voice, to where the direction that the voice was coming from, which was over to my left. I turned and I said, "Shut up." And I turned back to the woman behind the counter and I said, "Give me my 2 cakes. Well, the application of this dream in context of today's question, is no a bad word, is that there are external pressures and internal pressures in our lives that try to keep us silent, passive, and oppressed by using certain scriptures, even the idea that you're supposed to be a good person, or even further, you are supposed to be a good Christian. While we do seek to do good to others and to live out the character and nature of Christ, we also do not have to allow ourselves to be manipulated by the expectations of others, or even by the framework that we've allowed to be built up in our own minds as to what it means to be a good person, and even more, a good Christian. No is not a bad word. No basically is just a boundary, or as I like to say, it's just a decision. The word boundary has been a trendy buzzword over the past many years. I believe as people are beginning to realize that they've given away an unhealthy amount of influence in their own lives to others, and they're starting to realize that they need to make decisions for themselves. And as it is with everything, the idea of boundaries can be taken to an extreme and used in an unhealthy way. So let's talk about it for just a minute. Let's look at what a boundary actually is. So a boundary is basically just a line of demarcation. A personal boundary can be defined as a limit or a line that defines what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, particularly in relationships. Now, how are boundaries used in an unhealthy way? Let's look at that first. So number one, if my goal in setting this boundary is to punish someone or make them feel bad, well, that's an unhealthy use of a boundary. Number two, when a boundary is set without communication, to me, that is an unhealthy use of boundaries. In other words, like ghosting someone or withdrawing without any kind of conversation. That can be using a boundary in an unhealthy way. Also, when a boundary is used to attempt to gain control over another person. If I withdraw, or if I stop doing something in an effort to make another person respond by doing what I want them to do, that can be using a boundary as a form of control and manipulation, and that's certainly an unhealthy use of boundaries. Now, how are boundaries used in a healthy way? Well, first of all, I have to understand that boundaries are for me. My boundaries are for me. They are not for others. Once again, that goes back to trying to use boundaries to control others, and that's not healthy at all. So when I understand that boundaries are for me and not others, then I can go forward in a healthy way. And number two, when the goal of the boundary is actually to build strength for future connections. Maybe the way that that relationship has been progressing has not been beneficial in a mutual way, and some decisions need to be made so that strength can be gained and we can come into a place of health to attempt to connect again. That can be approaching a boundary in a healthy way. Number 3, when boundaries are used to protect our health and well-being. We are ultimately responsible for our own health, our own well-being, our own happiness, our own state of mind. And we have to make decisions that are going to build that health instead of tear it down. Now, here's just some tips concerning boundaries. To me, this is a way I like to look at it. I don't like to think of a boundary as a boundary, and this is why. To me, the word boundary implies an intent to separate, which can be necessary in certain situations. But for the most part, what I'm usually just trying to do is reevaluate and recalibrate that relationship or that situation so that it's in a place where it's mutually beneficial and healthy. So my goal is not usually to cut someone off forever or to separate from an organization forever, but it's just to get myself in a place where I'm healthy, where I'm strong, and I'm able to connect in a way that's best. Now, I like to think, rather than declaring something to be a boundary, I like to just think of it as a decision. I'm literally just making a decision. I don't have to make a big announcement and post it and hold up a banner saying, this is my boundary. All I have to do is make a decision. So that's the way I like to view boundaries. I'm making a decision in this moment for this season in my life that's going to produce a healthy outcome. It's my job ultimately to make those decisions. If I let others make all those decisions for me and the outcome ends up being negative, I can end up feeling like a victim and also feeling a sense of resentment or bitterness toward that person or that organization if I've given all my power over to them. Another tip is that personal boundaries start with I. Like we said earlier, personal boundaries are for us. They're not for other people because we can't control other people, and that's not the goal. So personal boundaries start with I. For instance, instead of telling someone, you better stop talking to me like this or I'm going to leave, right? That's like a command. That's like an ultimatum given, and that's usually met with more resistance and a heightened sense of intensity. So instead of saying that, I could say, I would love to have this conversation when we're calm and respectful. Sounds a little cheesy, right? But it helps. It helps to have a script in place because when emotions get involved, things can tend to escalate. So if I already know that I'm going to phrase my comments in an I statement, then that helps me not to activate more of an aggression in that conversation. So I would love to have this conversation when we are calm and respectful. Also, instead of saying, someone's borrowing money from us continually and we're at the point where we're feeling tapped out as far as that goes, instead of saying, you can't borrow money from me anymore, I could say something like, I'm happy to be able to help today, but for the next 3 months, I'm not going to be able to provide you with any more money. Now, that's not telling them that they're lazy and they need to go get a job and they're just mooching off of us. That's not accusatory in any way. It's really just stating what I'm going to do and how I'm positioning myself in this situation. So there's really no place for arguing there because there's nothing to argue with. This is just a decision that I'm making. It's not personal, it's not accusatory, it's simply a decision. Now, another thing about boundaries is they are flexible and they are temporary. If we hold to them beyond their necessary time frame, then they can become a prison for us instead of a protection to us. We're continually growing in life, and so are others. What was helpful yesterday may not be necessary today, and it could actually cause us to live a much smaller, refined life with a lot of restrictions placed on our relationships, which hold us back from fulfillment. In one season, it was helpful, but it's always good to reevaluate and say, can I make a different decision today? Am I still in the same place I was when I made that decision previously, or can I make adjustments today? They are flexible and they are temporary. Otherwise, they will become a prison to us. Now, I will say, be aware, okay? Boundaries can reveal the true intent and nature of relationships. We'll find when we start making these decisions, being responsible for our own sense of well-being and making decisions accordingly, we'll see that relationships will begin to change, dynamics will begin to change, and some might even end altogether. This can be good though. If you had what you thought was a friendship and then you actually realize that you were really just the on-call babysitter. In other words, when you are called to babysit and you normally would have said yes, but this time you say, I'm unable to do that, all of a sudden the talking slows down, the calls slow down, the fellowship slows down, and it begins to reveal maybe it was a little bit more founded on your ability to babysit rather than enjoying your genuine company. So when that's revealed, that's a good thing, right? Or if you thought that you were just their favorite cousin, but it actually turns out you were kind of just a convenient ATM. So when we start making those decisions for our own financial well-being to say, I'm not able to help you out with that today, and then all of a sudden the love stops, the conversation stops, the invitation stops. It's painful and it hurts. But if we look at it from another perspective, it actually can be very good because it reveals that what we thought was taking place was not necessarily what was. And then we can make decisions that create room in our lives to create those genuine types of relationships. Now, every relationship has give and take. There's no relationship that does not have an exchange, but sometimes you can realize that you're giving maybe a little bit more than you're receiving. And when you make that adjustment, it allows us to make choices for the future and for where we're going to invest our time and our energy may not be in that same place anymore. And that's okay. But do be aware that when you start saying no, when you start declining, when you start making decisions that are for your well-being, it will change the dynamic of your relationship. So be prepared for that. Also, something to think about is when to let others influence your decisions or your boundaries. Number one, when you have a relationship that has a track record of trust and care for you, you can look back and you can see where this person was a help to you, they were a guide to you, and they weren't looking to get anything out of their assistance in your life. Another time is when that person is not being directly affected by your decision or your boundary, whether good or bad. So a way to think about that is, will this person benefit if I follow their advice? Now, if they do, that's okay. It doesn't mean throw out their advice and don't allow them any influence, but do factor that into the degree of influence that you allow their voice in your life, knowing they may benefit from this or they may be damaged if I make this decision. I'm going to weigh it, but I'm also going to factor that in. Another time to let others influence your decisions about boundaries is when a commitment has been made that needs to be adjusted. So we've already made a commitment to move along in this way, but now I'm looking and saying, I need to make a change here. Well, that's when you want to come into communication with that person or that organization if you want to continue on that route, and you need to reevaluate the give and the take, reevaluate the terms of that relationship. For instance, a work relationship. So if I apply at McDonald's and I say I'm willing to take care of those hamburgers and serve those customers, but then a few months go by and I decide that's not working for me anymore, and I tell my manager, look, I'm willing to come up here and hang out from 8 to 4, but I'm no longer going to be taking orders from customers and I'm not going to be taking care of those hamburgers. Well, now I'm adjusting the terms of our previously agreed upon relationship, and they have every right to say, well, it was so nice to know you, but this relationship is now going to come to an end. Why? Because that was the foundation of that relationship. The thing about it is, when we don't know that that is the foundation of the relationship and we set a boundary and then all of a sudden things go silent. But in these situations, we already know this is what we agreed on. So then we need to come together and make a new decision. Now, here's another statement. When I heard this, I just thought it was so amazing because it kind of blew my mind. And the statement was, no is a complete sentence. And I was thinking, no, it's not. You can't just tell somebody no. Well, obviously, we don't just want to be answering people with a harsh no. Of course, in the beginning of the video, that was just for fun. But typically, we're going to let people know in a polite way, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm not going to be able to make it. I really appreciate you thinking about me, though, right? But there are some situations when no is a complete sentence, and here are some of those. Number one, when people don't respect your boundaries or your polite refusal. So let's say you thanked them for that opportunity, but you let them know you weren't going to be able to come and they just wouldn't take no for an answer. Well, Another time, when people use your reasoning as ammunition against you or to build an argument to coerce you back into a yes. How do you know when that's taking place? Well, if you're in a situation where you go into the conversation and you've already made up your mind, I'm not going to be able to participate. I'm going to have to decline and say no. You've already made that decision and you've made plans to do something else, but you go into the conversation and you end up leaving having said yes. Well, what happened? By the end of that conversation, your mind was changed, but you still don't want to do it, but you lost your no, okay? So those might be situations where no is a complete sentence. When your explanation could be used against you, or when there just is not respect for your decision overall. That's where no is a complete sentence. Of course, you'd have to try that out for yourself. It will come with reactions, okay? So be ready for that. Now we want to take a look for a minute because we put this upon the premise of this dream I had where this voice was telling me you are supposed to be a Christian, as though it was predetermined that I would not be able to press forward for justice or for what was right, or I would be perceived as not being a Christian. Well, I know that's a lie. I hope you know that as well. But I do want to take a minute to look at a few examples where Jesus had boundaries. I mean, and as I started to look into this, it was just over and over and over again. But sometimes we see that as hard to relate to us because it's like, well, everything Jesus did, he had some kind of spiritual answer behind it. And so we think that we can't say no unless we have some deep spiritual answer behind it. But the point is here that there's a principle, and that principle is boundaries or decisions, okay? So Jesus made decisions that were in line with his life, that were in line with his commission, that were in line with his intent and what he was setting himself to do. Even just looking at John chapter 7, if you go back and read that, Jesus' family was trying to push him to attend a feast. They were telling him, hey, you're not going to be known and recognized if you don't come to this feast. And Jesus let him know, it is not time for me to go. And he didn't go with them, even though his family pushed him to go. He actually waited and went privately at a later time. Guess what? That was a decision. That was a boundary. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing it right now, and I'm not doing it in the way that you are telling me to do it. It was a decision that he made. So looking at John chapter 11, Jesus waited to go see Lazarus despite the immediate request of Lazarus' sisters. He waited for 2 days. So basically he said, no, I'm not coming right now. I'm waiting and I will come later. That was the decision that Jesus made. There were also times when Jesus did not include all of his 12 disciples in his ministry. There are times where he just took 3. There were 3 that went with him on several occasions. Those are also boundaries. Everybody couldn't come to everything. Another time, and this was interesting to me, is when Jesus, as we know this as his first miracle, but when the wedding ran out of wine and Jesus' mother told Jesus to make some wine basically. And Jesus said, no, we're not doing that right now. But Mary pushed and she told the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. And we all know that Jesus did do it. He went ahead and turned water into wine. But I love that example because it goes back to the fact that boundaries are temporary and they're flexible. Now, I don't know why Jesus seemed, in my perspective, to change his mind. I don't know. It doesn't say, and I'm not really pushing as to the why. It's just the fact that he did lets us know that sometimes we can make a decision in one moment, but when we come back and look at it, we don't have to hold ourselves to a boundary as a law, because then it becomes a prison. So for whatever his reason was, he was able to adjust that even very quickly and move forward and turn that water into wine. So you can keep reading. When Jesus drove the money exchangers out of the temple, that was a boundary. There were so many times where Jesus was setting boundaries. We, as Christians, even good Christians, if we want to phrase it that way, we can set boundaries. We can make decisions. I don't like to call it setting boundaries. We can make decisions. And I would even say we are responsible for making decisions for our well-being of mind, of emotion, of time, of finances, our spiritual well-being, all of the above. Now, when you're in relationship with people, be careful about that and include them in those decisions to whatever degree you're able to do that. Now, I want to look at why is it important that we know that we have the responsibility to say no in some situations or set a boundary. So if we don't and we allow others to take advantage of us, we may find that we feel misused, taken advantage of, and eventually we will probably become worn out, and we might even feel resentful or bitter toward that person or that organization that is making those decisions for us. Also, if we're conflicted by feelings of guilt because we're not really sure if we have that right or not, we can become overly aggressive and even have an attitude about it. We don't necessarily have to snap out our boundaries or shake our head or scream or demand. All we really have to do is make a decision and state it. When I have that frame of mind, it allows me to be calm, to be caring, and to be unattacking in my approach and my communication with others. And the final note I want to make here is that after we make that decision, we must leave others responsible for their own feelings about it. We will experience mental turmoil if we meditate on how we think they feel about us now that we've made that decision. But we have to leave that up to them. That's on their page. And if they want to discuss it further, they know how to reach out and to approach us. But as long as we have that initial conversation with them to the best that we're able to do so, we can feel at peace, knowing that we did nothing out of malice. We didn't do anything trying to control other people. We weren't trying to punish them. We're simply making decisions, taking responsibility for our own sense of well-being in this moment and in this season. So I hope that helped you out today. Be free to make a decision. Be free to decline a request. Be free. And will you do it perfectly? You won't. There'll be times where you look back and say, you know, I probably could have went ahead and did that. But guess what? That's why it's called the journey. We're learning as we go along. Perfection is not the goal. Growth and maturity is. So be encouraged, be blessed. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.